February 12, 1962. The Oval Office, Washington, D.C. President John Fitzgerald Kennedy hung up the phone and turned to his aide, Kenny O'Donnell. His face was red. His jaw was clenched tight. He looked like a man who had just been told something he wasn't accustomed to hearing, something that simply didn't happen to the President of the United States. He said no. Kenny O'Donnell looked up from the stack of papers on his desk, momentarily confused. "I'm sorry, Mr. President." "Who said no?" Kennedy leaned back in his chair, staring at the telephone receiver like it had personally insulted him. "Dean Martin. I just invited him to perform at the White House, and he said no." Kenny blinked. He had worked alongside John F. Kennedy for years. He had been there through the grueling campaign trail, through the narrow victory over Nixon, through the Bay of Pigs disaster, through tense negotiations with Khrushchev. He had seen the President of the United States charm foreign dignitaries, negotiate with world leaders, and win over entire populations with nothing more than a boyish smile and a few well-chosen words. But he had never, not once, seen President Kennedy look quite this bewildered. "Did he give you a reason, sir?" Kennedy let out a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, he gave me a reason. He said, and I'm quoting here, 'Mr. President, I don't perform for politicians. I perform for people who paid to see me.'" Kenny didn't know what to say. In 1962, when the President of the United States personally called you on the telephone and asked you to do something, you didn't say no. You didn't negotiate. You didn't ask questions. And you certainly didn't lecture the most powerful man in the free world about your personal policy regarding performances. You said yes. You said thank you. And you felt honored. But Dean Martin wasn't like most people. To understand just how shocking this moment was, you need to understand what it meant to receive a personal phone call from President John F. Kennedy in 1962. This wasn't just some political favor being called in. This wasn't a routine invitation to a fundraiser. This was a direct request from the leader of the free world. This was access to power. This was prestige. This was the kind of opportunity that could launch careers, open doors, and cement legacies for generations. Frank Sinatra had performed for Kennedy multiple times. So had Sammy Davis Jr., Ella Fitzgerald, Nat King Cole, Tony Bennett, and a dozen other entertainment legends. Hollywood worshipped JFK. He was young, handsome, charismatic, brilliant. He represented everything America wanted to be. Elegant, confident, forward-thinking, unstoppable. The Rat Pack had practically served as Kennedy's unofficial entertainment wing during the 1960 campaign. They had raised millions of dollars. They had rallied crucial votes in swing states. They had turned the election into a cultural moment, blending the glamour of Hollywood with the power of Washington in ways that had never been done before. Dean Martin had been part of that world. He had attended the glittering fundraisers. He had sung at the packed rallies. He had posed for photographs with his arm around Frank Sinatra and Jack Kennedy, all three of them grinning like they owned the world. He had raised his glass and toasted to the dawn of Camelot, to a new era of American greatness. But when President John F. Kennedy personally picked up the telephone and asked Dean Martin to come to the White House for an intimate cultural performance on the evening of March 3, 1962, Dean Martin did something that no one in Hollywood, no one in Washington, and certainly no one in the Oval Office expected. He said no. Let's rewind to earlier that morning. February 12, 1962. Beverly Hills, California. Dean Martin was sitting by the pool at his sprawling home on a mountain drive. It was a gorgeous Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that reminded you why people moved to Southern California in the first place. The sun was warm, but not oppressive. The sky was a perfect, cloudless blue. A gentle breeze rustled the palm trees. Dean was doing what he did most mornings when he wasn't working. Absolutely nothing of consequence. He was barefoot, wearing a white terry cloth robe over his pajamas. A cup of black coffee sat on the table beside him, steam rising lazily into the air. A lit cigarette rested in the ashtray. Dean was reading Variety, catching up on industry gossip, box office numbers, and who was making what deals. The radio played softly in the background, crooning some forgettable love song. This was Dean's sanctuary. No telephones, no meetings, no obligations, no people demanding things from him. Just peace, quiet, and the simple pleasure of an unhurried morning. His housekeeper, a kind middle-aged woman named Maria, who had worked for Dean for nearly 5 years, appeared at the sliding glass door leading from the house to the pool area. She looked nervous. "Mr. Martin, excuse me, there's a telephone call for you." Dean didn't even look up from his paper. "Take a message, Maria." "Sir, the operator said it's from the White House." Dean took a slow drag from his cigarette. "Tell them I'm unavailable." Maria hesitated, wringing her hands slightly. "Sir, she said it's President Kennedy. The president is on the line." Dean finally glanced up, studying Maria's anxious face for a moment. Then he sighed, folded his newspaper, stubbed out his cigarette, and stood up. "All right, I'll take it in the study." He walked through the house, tightening the belt on his robe, and picked up the telephone receiver in his wood-paneled study. "This is Dean." The voice on the other end of the line was unmistakable, smooth, confident, dripping with that distinctive Massachusetts accent that had charmed half the country. "Dean, it's Jack Kennedy." Dean leaned against the edge of his desk. "Mr. President, what can I do for you this morning?" Kennedy's tone was warm, friendly, utterly assured. "Dean, I'm calling because I'd like to extend a personal invitation for you to come perform at the White House. We're hosting a small evening on March 3rd. Very intimate, very elegant. Members of the cabinet will be there, a few key senators, some close friends. Cultural, sophisticated. The moment I started planning it, I thought of you." Dean was quiet for a beat, listening to the expectation in Kennedy's voice. The unspoken assumption that Dean would, naturally, enthusiastically, gratefully, say yes. "I appreciate you thinking of me, Mr. President, but I'm going to have to decline." There was a pause on the other end of the line. A long, uncomfortable pause. The kind of pause that happens when someone hears words their brain simply refuses to process. "I'm sorry, Dean. I'm not sure I heard you correctly." "I said I'm going to have to pass, Mr. President. I don't perform at private political events. It's a personal policy of mine." Kennedy's tone shifted ever so slightly. Still friendly, still charming, but now there was a thin edge underneath. "Dean, I think you may have misunderstood. This isn't a political event. This isn't a fundraiser. This is a cultural evening at the White House. You'd be performing for the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, leaders of the free world. This is an honor." Dean's voice remained calm, even, utterly unruffled. "I understand that, Mr. President, and I'm sure it will be a wonderful evening. But my policy is very simple. I don't perform for free for politicians. I perform for people who buy tickets to my shows. That's who I work for. That's my audience." There was another pause. Kennedy was clearly trying to recalibrate, trying to figure out how to navigate this utterly unexpected situation. Dean, are you seriously telling me that you won't sing for the President of the United States? Mr. President, with all due respect, I sing for people, not for titles. If you'd like to come to Las Vegas and buy a ticket to my show at the Sands Hotel, I'll sing for you all night long. I'll personally pour you a drink. We'll have a wonderful time. But I don't do command performances. Not for anyone. Not ever. The silence on the other end of the line stretched out. Dean could almost hear the gears turning in Kennedy's mind, the president trying to decide how to respond to this unprecedented rejection. Finally, Kennedy said, his voice carefully controlled, "I see. So there's nothing I can say that would change your mind?" "I'm afraid not, Mr. President." And then Dean Martin said something that would echo through the halls of Hollywood for decades to come. Something that Frank Sinatra would never forgive him for. Something that would come to define Dean's relationship with power and authority for the rest of his life. "Besides, Mr. President, you've already got Frank for that sort of thing. He loves playing the court jester for politicians. Me? I'm just a saloon singer. I sing in saloons for people who drink. That's my lane, and I'm comfortable staying in it." President John F. Kennedy was silent. Completely, utterly silent. Then, his voice tight and clipped, he said, "I see. Well, thank you for your time, Dean. I appreciate your candor. Anytime, Mr. President. You have a good day." Click. Kennedy hung up. Dean set the telephone receiver back in its cradle, walked back outside to the pool, sat down in his chair, lit a fresh cigarette, picked up his newspaper, and went right back to reading about box office receipts. But the shockwave from that 3-minute phone call was only just beginning to spread. Within 2 hours, Frank Sinatra knew about it. Within 4 hours, everyone in the Rat Pack knew. Within 6 hours, half of Hollywood knew. Dean Martin had told the President of the United States to buy a ticket if he wanted to hear him sing. Frank Sinatra was at his sprawling compound in Palm Springs when the phone call came. He was sitting in his living room reviewing contract negotiations for an upcoming film when his assistant, a nervous young man named George, came rushing in. "Mr. Sinatra, I just got a call from a contact in Washington. Apparently, Dean turned down an invitation to perform at the White House." Frank looked up slowly from his paperwork. "What did you just say?" "Dean Martin. He turned down President Kennedy's personal invitation to perform at the White House. Refused it outright." Frank stood up. His expression went from confusion to disbelief to volcanic rage in about 3 seconds flat. "Get Dean on the phone. Right now." 5 minutes later, Dean's telephone rang. He was still sitting by the pool. "Yeah? Dean, what in the hell is wrong with you?" Dean held the phone slightly away from his ear. Frank's voice was so loud it was distorting. "Hello, Frank. How's your morning going?" "Don't you hello, Frank me. I just heard from 3 separate people that you told President Kennedy to shove his White House invitation up his ass. Please, for the love of God, tell me that's not true." Dean took a calm drag from his cigarette. "It's true. Well, not the shoving part. I was perfectly polite. I just told him I don't do private political performances." "Are you out of your goddamn mind?" "Frank, you're going to give yourself a stroke. Relax." "Relax? Dean, the President of the United States personally called you and invited you to perform at the White House, and you said no. Do you understand what you've done? Do you have any concept of how many people would kill for that opportunity?" Dean exhaled a stream of smoke. "Then let them have it. I'm not interested." Frank was pacing now, his voice climbing even higher. "You're not interested? You're not interested in performing for the President of the United States. The man we campaigned for? The man we helped put in the Oval Office? We campaigned for him because we believed in what he stood for, Frank. That doesn't mean I owe him free entertainment. This isn't about the money, Dean. I never said it was about money. I said it's about principle. I don't perform for politicians as favors. I perform for paying customers. That's my job. That's my contract with the world. Frank stopped pacing. There was a dangerous edge to his voice now. Dean, listen to me very carefully. This is a colossal mistake. You are insulting the President of the United States. You are making enemies in Washington. And worst of all, you're making me look bad. Dean's voice hardened just slightly. How exactly am I making you look bad, Frank? Because I'm the one who vouched for you. I'm the one who told Jack Kennedy that you were a stand-up guy, that you were part of the team, that you were someone he could count on. And now you're spitting in his face and making me look like a fool. I never asked you to vouch for me, Frank, and I never agreed to be part of anyone's team except my own. Frank took a deep breath, trying to control his anger. Dean, I am asking you, as your friend, as your brother, call the president back, apologize. Tell him you'll do the performance. No. Dean, no, Frank. I'm not apologizing for having boundaries, and I'm not doing the show. This conversation is over. Frank's voice went ice cold. You're going to regret this, Dean. I promise you that. You're going to regret this for the rest of your life. And he slammed the phone down. Dean hung up, stubbed out his cigarette, and went inside to take a shower. He didn't regret it. Not then, not ever. But the consequences of that single phone call were only beginning to unfold. In the days and weeks that followed, the story spread through Hollywood like wildfire. It didn't make the newspapers. The Kennedy administration made absolutely certain of that. But privately, within the industry, everyone knew. Dean Martin had said no to the president. The reactions were sharply divided. Half of Hollywood thought Dean had lost his mind. They thought he was reckless, arrogant, self-destructive. Who in their right mind turns down the President of the United States? The other half quietly, privately admired him. In an industry built on ass-kissing and favor trading, Dean Martin had drawn a line in the sand and refused to cross it. That took guts, but there were real consequences. Within a week, Dean started noticing subtle shifts. Invitations to high-profile political events stopped arriving. Fundraisers that used to call his manager Herman Citron went silent. There were whispers circulating through the industry that Dean Martin was difficult, that he didn't play ball, that he was unreliable. Even more painful, the relationship between Dean and Frank Sinatra grew strained and distant. Frank Sinatra had worked incredibly, exhaustingly hard to cultivate a relationship with the Kennedy family. He had raised millions of dollars for JFK's campaign. He had hosted the Kennedys at his Palm Springs compound. He had even built a helicopter pad on his property specifically for President Kennedy to use. And then, in 1962, Kennedy had publicly snubbed Frank by choosing to stay at Bing Crosby's house instead of Frank's during a California visit. The reason? Attorney General Bobby Kennedy was concerned about Frank's associations with organized crime figures. Frank had been devastated, humiliated, heartbroken. And now, after all of that pain, Dean Martin, who Frank considered his brother, had turned down a personal invitation from the very president that Frank had desperately wanted to please. In Frank's mind, Dean didn't understand what he had done. He didn't grasp the delicate, complicated politics of balancing Hollywood and Washington. He didn't realize that sometimes you have to play the game, even when you don't want to. But Dean understood perfectly. He just didn't care. 3 weeks after the phone call, at a Rat Pack rehearsal in Las Vegas, the tension finally came to a head. They were at the Sands Hotel, preparing for their upcoming residency. Dean, Frank, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop were all in the same rehearsal space, but the energy was wrong. Off, cold. Frank was distant with Dean, not openly hostile but noticeably cool. Short answers, no jokes, no warmth. Sammy Davis Jr. noticed immediately. During a break, he pulled Dean aside. "Dean, what the hell is going on between you and Frank?" Dean lit a cigarette. "You know what's going on, Sammy. The Kennedy thing." Sammy shook his head, genuinely baffled. "Dean, I gotta be honest with you, I don't get it. Why didn't you just do the show? It's one night. You sing a few songs, you shake a few hands, and it's over. Why turn it into such a big production?" Dean looked at Sammy Davis Jr., who had faced more racism, more hatred, more obstacles than almost anyone else in the entertainment industry. Sammy, who had fought tooth and nail for every opportunity he'd ever received. "Sammy, let me ask you something. When you perform, do you do it because someone ordered you to or because you chose to?" "Because I choose to, of course." "Exactly. And the second I start performing because a politician snaps his fingers and tells me to, I stop being an entertainer and I become a dancing monkey. A trained seal. I'm not doing that. Not for the president, not for anyone." Sammy nodded slowly. "I hear you, Dean. I do. But don't you think there's value in supporting the president? In being part of something bigger than yourself?" Dean exhaled a long stream of smoke. "Sammy, I voted for Jack Kennedy. I believe in the man. I think he's a great president. But that doesn't mean I owe him a free performance. I don't owe anyone my talent unless they're sitting in a seat they paid money for. That's the only contract I honor." Sammy smiled sadly. "You're one stubborn son of a bitch, you know that?" Dean smiled back. "Yeah, I've been told." Later that evening, after the rehearsal ended, Frank Sinatra finally confronted Dean directly. Everyone else had left. It was just the two of them, alone in the empty showroom. Frank was leaning against the bar, nursing a glass of Jack Daniels, staring at Dean from across the room. "You really don't get it, do you?" Dean looked up. "Get what, Frank?" "What you did, what it means. The damage you caused." "I know exactly what I did, Frank. I told the president I don't do private political performances. That's it. That's the whole story." Frank shook his head slowly. "It's not that simple, Dean. In this business, in this town, relationships matter. Access matters. Power matters. You don't just burn bridges with the most powerful man on the planet because you've got some ridiculous principle about not performing for free." Dean's voice was calm but firm. "It's not a ridiculous principle, Frank. It's who I am. I don't bend for anyone. Not for the studios, not for the mob, not for you, and not for the President of the United States. That's not arrogance. That's self-respect." Frank stared at him for a long moment. Then he drained his glass and set it down hard on the bar. "You know what your problem is, Dean? You think you're above it all. You think you don't need anyone. You think you can just float through life on your talent and your charm and never have to compromise, never have to play the game. But you're wrong. Everyone needs people. Everyone needs connections. and you just threw away one of the most important connections you could ever have." Dean stood up. "If the only way to keep that connection is to betray who I am, then I don't want it." Frank grabbed his coat. "Fine, do it your way. But don't come crying to me when the whole thing falls apart." And he walked out. Dean stood alone in the empty showroom, the silence pressing in around him. But he didn't feel regret. He felt free. Because Dean Martin had learned a long time ago, growing up poor in Steubenville, Ohio, that the only person you ever truly have to answer to is yourself. And he'd been answering to himself ever since. 3 years later, something happened that changed the entire story. March 1963. Los Angeles, California. There was a charity gala at the Beverly Hilton Hotel. A massive, star-studded event to raise money for children's hospitals. Everyone who mattered in Hollywood was there. Politicians, movie stars, musicians, directors. And President John F. Kennedy was the guest of honor. Dean Martin was standing near the bar, nursing a scotch, when he saw Kennedy across the crowded ballroom. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then President Kennedy walked directly toward Dean Martin. He extended his hand. "Dean Martin, good to see you." Dean shook his hand firmly. "Mr. President." Kennedy smiled. That famous, disarming Kennedy smile. "You know, I've never forgotten that phone call we had. You were the only person in my entire presidency who ever told me no." Dean raised an eyebrow. "And how did that work out for you, Mr. President?" Kennedy laughed. A genuine, surprised laugh. "Honestly, I respected the hell out of you for it. Most people in this town will do absolutely anything for access, for a photo opportunity, for a chance to say they shook hands with the president. You didn't. You stood your ground. That takes real courage." Dean nodded. "I appreciate you saying that, sir." Kennedy looked at him thoughtfully. "You know, the invitation still stands. If you ever change your mind, the White House would be truly honored to have you." Dean smiled. "I'll keep that in mind, Mr. President." Kennedy patted him on the shoulder. "You do that, Dean." And then he walked away. That was the last conversation Dean Martin and John F. Kennedy ever had. 8 months later, on November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Dean Martin, like the rest of the world, mourned. He watched the funeral on television. He saw Jackie Kennedy in her black veil. He saw little John F. Kennedy Jr. salute his father's casket. He saw a nation weep for a fallen leader who had represented hope and change and possibility. And Dean felt the immense weight of that loss. But he never regretted saying no. Because to Dean Martin, integrity wasn't situational. It wasn't something you turned on and off, depending on who was asking. Integrity was absolute. Years later, in a rare interview in the 1980s, Dean was asked about the incident. "Mr. Martin, is it true that you once turned down an invitation to perform at the White House for President Kennedy?" Dean smiled. "Yeah, that's true." "Can I ask why?" Dean took a sip of his drink. "Because I don't work for politicians. I work for audiences. The only people I answer to are the ones who buy tickets to my shows." "Do you regret it?" Dean shook his head. "Not for 1 second. Even knowing that it strained your relationship with Frank Sinatra and others?" Dean's expression softened slightly. "Frank and I had our problems, but it wasn't really about Kennedy. It was about Frank expecting me to be someone I wasn't. And I couldn't do that. Not for Frank, not for anyone." That interview clip has been replayed thousands of times over the years. It became a perfect encapsulation of who Dean Martin was. A man who couldn't be bought, couldn't be controlled, couldn't be compromised. After Kennedy's assassination, Frank Sinatra eventually softened toward Dean. The grief and the perspective that comes with loss put their petty conflicts into proper context. At a Rat Pack performance in early 1964, Frank publicly acknowledged Dean on stage. "You know," Frank said to the packed audience, "Dean Martin is the most stubborn, hard-headed, impossible human being I have ever known in my entire life. He doesn't listen to me. He doesn't listen to the president. He doesn't listen to God himself, I'm pretty sure." The audience laughed. Frank looked directly at Dean. "But you know what? I respect the hell out of him for it. Because in a world full of people begging for approval and kissing ass and doing whatever they're told, Dean Martin stands there and says, 'I'm good. I don't need your validation.' And that takes real guts." Dean raised his glass toward Frank. Frank raised his glass back. "To the king of cool, ladies and gentlemen, the only man in America who ever told a president to go buy a ticket." The audience erupted in applause. And just like that, the tension dissolved. Because the Rat Pack was about more than politics or egos, it was about brotherhood. And brothers fight. But they also forgive. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995, at the age of 78. At his funeral, Frank Sinatra was too ill to attend in person. But he sent a message that was read aloud to the mourners. "Dean Martin was the coolest man I ever knew. But more importantly, he was the most honest. He never pretended to be something he wasn't. He never bent. He never broke. And he never apologized for being exactly who he was. The world needs more Dean Martins. I loved him, and I'll miss him every single day for the rest of my life." At the reception following the funeral, someone told the story about Dean refusing to sing for President Kennedy. Everyone in the room smiled. Because it was so perfectly, quintessentially Dean. That's the real story of the day Dean Martin refused to sing for President Kennedy. It's not a story about disrespect. It's not a story about arrogance. It's a story about integrity, about knowing who you are and refusing to compromise that for anyone, no matter how powerful they might be. Dean Martin understood something that most people never learn, that true freedom comes from answering only to yourself. And he lived that truth every single day of his life. That's why, more than 25 years after his death, we're still telling his story. Because in a world that constantly demands we bend, compromise, and sell out, Dean Martin stood absolutely firm. And he reminded us all that sometimes the coolest thing you can possibly do is simply say no.